Live from Coral Gables. It's Saturday night, right? Thank you all so much for being here. My name is Steve. On behalf of everyone here at Books and Books, we're very happy to have you with us here this evening. I alert you very quickly while you're silencing your cell phones, take a look at our Books and Books newsletter. This will give you a synopsis of all the wonderful events we have at Books and Books just about every night of the week. We do 60 plus events every month. We have Spanish events, kids events, poetry readings, first-time authors, celebrity signings. Tomorrow night we have Martin Amis will be here. We've got books on sale for that and tickets on sale for that to be here as well. There's always an event for everyone's taste. You can go to our website at booksandbooks.com and give us your email address, and you'll never be lonely with the amount of emails that we send you, so you can be acquainted with everything that we have. And you will notice that a lot of our events now are live streamed through the internet. There's a couple of cameras around the store, so if you want to take a moment to tweet about this or send an email to your friends to tune in, we'd appreciate that. And I will also give you fair warning that these cameras are pointed at the audience for the question and answer period later, so please make sure you're sitting next to who you're supposed to be sitting next to. I also remind you that flash photography interferes with the live streaming, so if we could refrain from doing that, I appreciate that. Anyway, I encourage you to visit our website at booksandbooks.com, give us your email, check out all of our live stream events, and while the event is in progress, you can even call if you're watching on the internet. We can get a book signed by the author and have it shipped to you for no charge for the shipping, at least in the US, and you can even ask a question of the author while the event is in progress. So it's very, very interactive. But tonight we are very happy to have with us Margaret Bradham Thornton and her new book, Charleston. Tonight, a gifted writer makes her fiction debut with this lyrical and haunting story of missed chances and enduring love, set against the backdrop of high society Charleston, which probes the eternal question, can we ever truly go home again? Set against the backdrop of stately homes and the seductive low country landscape, Charleston is an evocative, melancholy novel about one woman's love for both a man and an unforgettable city. It's an emotionally resonant, beguiling in its atmosphere, and it illuminates the elusive notion of home and explores whether we truly can ever go back to the place and the people that indelibly shaped us. Margaret Bradham Thornton is the editor of Tennessee Williams Notebooks, for which she received the Bronze Forward Magazine Book of the Year Award for autobiography and the Holman Prize for the best volume of Southern Literature Scholarship, given by the Society for the Study of Southern Literature. She's a native of Charleston, a graduate of Princeton University. She currently lives in Palm Beach. We're very happy to have her with us. Please welcome Margaret Bradham Thornton.
Oh, thank you, Steve, for that lovely introduction. I just wanted to thank Books and Books for having me here. This is an amazing bookstore. And I wanted to thank my sister-in-law, Nancy Hector, for arranging this with Susan Heatley, Elizabeth Bennett, and Louise Schwartz. So that's incredibly kind of you. So thank you very much. As Steve mentioned, I worked editing and annotating the notebooks of Tennessee Williams. And so I thought I'd spend a little bit of time talking about that, how his work informed my process, what I think my novel's about, and then I'd do a short reading. When I started the work on Tennessee Williams, I was writing some short fiction and having some success with it. And I thought that the Tennessee Williams project would take me about 3 years. It ended up taking me 10, and 7 missed deadlines. And somewhere along the way, I had to stop writing fiction because there's such different ways of thinking, and I just couldn't tell my editor that I was doing anything else but working at Tennessee Williams. But it wasn't a bad thing in a way that I had to stop, because it was very instructive to me, because I really saw how Tennessee Williams taught himself how to write. The notebooks that I edited, half were written before The Glass Menagerie, and they were really a very private, emotional record and a creative record of, I think one of our greatest playwrights. The 3 things that I learned most about how he taught himself how to write. The first was it's okay to write a really bad first draft, because it's all about the rewriting. There are over 2,000 unpublished manuscripts. And a lot of them are unpublished for a reason. They're just, false starts or false endings. And if we just take The Glass Menagerie, for example, it took him 8 years to complete, which seems it's a small little seamless play. And he had 8 different endings. For example, there are some very happy endings where Laura and the gentleman caller go off in a horse and buggy into the sunset. And my favorite one is another happy ending, which, he realized it was not a good idea, but he has a regiment of gentlemen callers coming over the horizon to Laura, who's sitting on the porch. And somewhere along the way, he understood that those were not the best ideas. But it's just about how inefficient really the creative process is, and when I go to schools and talk to classes, that's the thing I think that I can tell them that's really the most valuable. Don't get upset if you hate your first draft, because you really have to love, and you have to love the process, but it's all about rewriting. The second thing I learned was how Williams really chose character over story. It was about the person and not the plot. Henry James talked about this when he said that the plot was really a rare accident, and it was really the human attestation to that event that was important. Arthur Miller, when he saw The Glass Menagerie, he said that Williams, that sheer sensibility was a driving force in dramatic structure, and that he really changed American drama by making form serve his utterance and not the other way around, because before, plays had a pretty rigid structure. In Tennessee Williams, if you look at any of his plays, they have different shapes. And the last thing, and perhaps the most important that I learned, and it took him 12 years to figure this out, Tennessee Williams committed to writing when he was 16 or 17, and he committed with the dedication of an elite athlete or a very gifted, serious musician. He wrote every day. He read tremendous amounts. He read the best people he could find. He read a lot of Faulkner, Ibsen, Chekhov. But even in his 20s, despite this dedication to writing, he really did not have much success. When he was, and I'll just give you an example of that. When he was in his third year in college, his father pulled him out of school because he had mediocre grades, and he had to work in a shoe factory for 3 years. And during that time, he would come home, having worked all day, dusting off shoe boxes, writing up orders, and he would drink a lot of black coffee, and he'd write short stories. And I found 22 rejected short stories that he sent out over those 3 years. So, just if one thinks about this, and I talk to students about this, you haven't been able to complete college. You want to be a writer. You sent out 22, and those are just the ones I found, short stories. Not only is no one recognizing that you're going to be a great writer, you can't even get published. I did find, incidentally, on a little sales slip, a part of a sonnet that he wrote, and I recognize the sonnet because during that period he sent 2 sonnets to Harriet Monroe, the famed editor of Poetry Magazine. And his cover letter said, "Would you do a stranger the kindness of a favor?" And so that was 12 years later, he took that line for Blanche. I've always depended on the kindness of strangers. But it's just interesting how he worked. He borrowed from himself, he borrowed from other people, and he was constantly using material. But at some point in his late 20s, he writes in his journals that he's going to write a picture of his own heart. And by that he means not sort of confessional writing, but about ideas that mattered to him and about emotions that mattered to him. And that's really when he started working on The Glass Menagerie in full, which, as I said, took him a long time. But that's really where his fiction and his drama really took off. So when I finished the journals in 2007, and I had a year of talks and things, but I turned back to my writing, and I realized during this whole journey with Tennessee Williams, there were really 3 things I wanted to write about that really moved me. One, I wanted to write about the South from the inside out. I had grown up in the South, and I felt that everything that I saw, either on television or in film, or even in a lot of fiction, it really dealt with a caricature of the South. And Stanley Hoffman said about Europe doesn't exist. There are 60 countries, almost 60 countries in Europe. And to say Europe doesn't mean anything. And while I'm not going to say the South doesn't exist, but the South is really different. I was just in Nashville and in Oxford, Mississippi, Asheville, Charleston. Those are 4 very different cities. So I wanted to write about Charleston. It's a very specific place. And I've spoken to some of you tonight who've either lived there or plan to move there. But it was founded in 1670, had very close ties to England, was a very wealthy city at one point, went through 2 wars, and still has close ties to England. And when I was growing up, it was, it really functioned like a small little island surrounded by all this amazing natural beauty. And so as a child, you really had to navigate the natural world as well as a civilized world. And so it was, I think, a very special place and an unusual place. I also wanted to write about Southern women because I think Southern women really get a bad rap. I mean, just turn on television and watch a movie. But you know, when Tennessee Williams wrote about Southern women, that was 60 years ago, and I think he wrote about them accurately. Women were really trapped in and by the South, and they really had to depend on men to rescue them. And if you think about Tennessee Williams' characters, Laura waits for a gentleman caller who never comes. Blanche waits to be rescued off the plantation. Maggie says about Brick that if she thought he was never going to make love to her again, she would go in the kitchen, find the sharpened knife, and stick it straight through her heart. So, you know, that was then. But now I think life has, you know, moved on for women. They're very independent. They're well educated. And my main character, Eliza, you know, can come and go back and forth with the South, and she doesn't define herself by her relationship with men. I also wanted to write about humility. When I was living in London when I was working on Tennessee Williams, and I was traveling back to the South a lot. And one of the first things I did when I got the project, I was trying to find the people that really knew Tennessee Williams because they were, you know, getting quite old. And he really didn't hang out with the famous people that were in his plays and in his movies, but he had some very special close friends. So I tracked them down. And as I was going to these towns like Macon, Georgia, and Clarksdale, Mississippi, and Columbus, Mississippi, I was driving a lot, and I was driving through these agrarian communities. And it just struck me how these communities are really controlled and humbled by the seasons. And with that sense of humility, there's a sense of patience, and there's a sense of resilience. And I found that a very comforting quality. And when I would go back to London, and I'd gone to Harvard Business School, and I worked on Wall Street, so, you know, it was a very different sort of group of people. I didn't find that sense of humility. And so I wanted to write about it because I thought it was really important. And then the last thing I wanted to write about was the fragility of second chances. And this really came out of a collision of two lines. When I was working in Tennessee Williams, there was a play that haunted me. It was called Summer and Smoke. And it was unusual for Tennessee Williams to take that play on because most of his plays are about longing and not about love. They're about women who want men that don't want them. But this play, along with The Rose Tattoo, was a play that really offered the possibility of love with John and Alma. I don't know if any of you are familiar with that play, but and there's this haunting line where John says to Alma, "It's been three or four times that we've come face to face. And each of those times we seem to be wanting to find something in each other without knowing what it is we want to find." So that seemed like a tragic line to me because these two people really should have been together. The play did okay. It sort of had mixed reviews. Tennessee Williams was never happy with it. He tried to write it a number of years later in Eccentricities of a Nightingale, and I don't think he improved it. And it's my sort of feeling that the reason he didn't improve it because I think these two characters should have been together, and he just didn't write about that. So if you hold that statement of John, I was then listening to a discussion by the Brazilian filmmaker Walter Salles, who, I don't know if you know his work, but Central Station, Behind the Sun, Motorcycle Diaries, On the Road. But he was talking about second chances, and he said second chances fascinated him, that they were the common denominator of all of his films. And he was so fascinated by them because they offered a sense of transformation and a sort of salvation. And that really struck me. So I started with those two ideas. What if you took two characters and that should have been together and gave them a second chance? A question that I thought was interesting is what would they be willing to risk for a second chance? So that's really where I started. So I thought I would just maybe read a small passage and make one stop along the way to explain something. So I'll set the scene. So the two main characters, Eliza Poinsett grew up in Charleston, art historian living in London. She is at a wedding. She has an English boyfriend in the countryside, and she gets a tap on her shoulder. It is from Henry Hayward, a newspaper man from Charleston, who she had had a very intense relationship about 10 years ago, and she hasn't seen him since. He finds out that she's coming back for her stepsister's party to Charleston. She really hasn't been back. And he makes her promise him that she will look him up. And so chapter 2 begins with Eliza on the plane flying back, thinking about, what it's like to go home. And this book for me is very much not that you can't go home again or there's no place like home. It's about home never really lets you go. And especially for I think, a Southerner. Marquez has that famous line in 100 Years of Solitude that he says a person doesn't belong to a place until they have someone buried in the ground. But for multi-generational Southerners, they have the opposite problem. Once you belong, do you ever not belong? She was flying in on the afternoon of her stepsister's party, cutting the edge as finely as she dared. Eliza looked out the airplane window, down at the landscape she knew so well. She liked seeing it from such a distance. So much of her time was spent looking at images on vertical surfaces at close range. Paintings hung on walls or projected onto screens. She had been thinking about distance and location in paintings for some time. She had gone to an exhibit at the Marlborough Gallery of a Spanish hyperrealist who had painted with such minute precision that she had overheard someone mistake one of his compositions for a photograph. He signed all of his work with a self-portrait no larger than a dime, painted as if it were reflected on the convex head of a silver tack. And then there was the Englishman who had covered the floor of the ground gallery of the Tate Modern with a spiral 20 meters in diameter, made of dried wooden sticks and pocket compasses of varying size and shapes. The title of the installation was, "What Interests Me is a Thing That Cannot Be Located." The work of the Spaniard and the Englishman demanded vastly different distances to be understood. I'm just going to pause there for 1 minute just to talk a little bit about the art in this book, because there's a lot, and I know that Miami Basil is coming up, so I thought it would be okay to talk about it. So I'm just going to begin a little bit with where the idea of Eliza came from, because I mentioned that I had these two characters and they were going to have a second chance. And she had a very odd beginning. I've always been interested in what artists say about their work and how they think about their work. And I listened to Tracy Emmons speak, and she, as many of you know, was sort of second to Damien Hirst in sort of sensationalist young British art. And she said that she found safety in art. And I thought that was such an odd thing for her to say, because she took such risk. And she has a famous bed that she was, I think, the finalist for the Turner Prize at the Tate. That was just a sort of messy, incredibly messy bed. But I sort of love that idea that you could find safety in art or safety in beauty. So I decided that I'd make my main character not an artist, but an art historian. And then I had to decide what she was going to work on. And I thought about Edward Hopper, because Edward Hopper in 1929 worked in Charleston and did really some beautiful watercolors. But if you've had your heart broken, I don't think Edward Hopper's sort of the best person for you. So I decided to go the sort of cold cerebral route and gave her Magritte, because Magritte said something which I also found fascinating. In talking about his paintings, he said, they were thoughts rendered visible. And I thought that was so powerful, because I think when we look at art, we sometimes think about ourselves, we sometimes try and work out problems, and I think in this book, Eliza very much does that in her work as an art historian. She sometimes has sort of parallel discussions about our life when she's actually analyzing art. And I think when she's looking down on the ground and thinking about the hyperrealist, and I'm going to show you a picture, she's thinking about her life coming back home and her life having once been with Henry. So she's thinking about, home and Henry, but she's looking at the art. The title of the installation I took from Jasper Johns. He said once, what interested him was a thing that cannot be located. And I thought, again, that was a pretty wonderful and mysterious comment, because, what is the thing and why can't it be located? Is it because you don't see it, you can't find it, or does it exist? And I think Eliza is very much thinking about her relationship with Henry. Does it exist? Can it be found? And I'm just going to show you There's also a lot in this book about compression and expansion. I deal a little bit with fractal geometry, just sort of how it can be thought about in art. And I think as she's looking down and thinking about the small drawing pen and then thinks about the 60-meter circle, this is kind of how her mind works. But I just want to show you the Spanish hyperrealist that she's thinking about. And at the time when I was writing this, he had only done 11 paintings. And I don't know if he's done more, but he was, I think he's sort of extraordinary. So this is the painting she's thinking of. And I don't know if you can see it, but that little drawing pen, that little tack, and is his self-portrait. So when you look at this painting and you look at that little tack, you see his face. And I just thought that was such an amazing way to sign a portrait. And I mean a painting. And then this is his portrait of his wife. And I think she's thinking about that too, which I think is a really beautiful portrait. And it's incredibly sensual. And yet it's kind of strange because the question is she resting? Is she sleeping, or is she dead? She's not on a bed. She's kind of on this platform. And yet the cool thing about this painting is the skin is so life real that when you look at it, you feel like if you scratched it, it would bleed. So I think, again, that's kind of amplifying. She's thinking about her relationship with Henry. So I'm going to get her back. We'll go back to the plane. And this piece, as she's looking down, is a lot about seeing with memory. And that sort of resonates throughout this book. Eliza returned her gaze to the window. Thousands of feet below, roads that curved and faded without apparent reason, snaked through large green, untouched forest. Unlike the ordered rectangles and quadrilaterals and polygons of the English countryside that fit together like irregular pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, everything here was sinuous, unordered, untamed. The only straight line she could see was the Southern Seaboard Railroad and the power lines that cut sharp tracks through large expanses of timber. Toward the coast, the solid forest gave way to winding rivers and irregular patches of marsh. Eliza guessed that the dark river that curled in lazy loops was the Ashley River. It reminded her of the white sugar icing her grandmother used to let her serpentine across the top of her lemon cakes. Eliza watched the plane's shadow flee in front of them across land that disappeared into marshes. She enjoyed the weightless feeling of the shadow's swift escape, precisely because running away from something or someone had never felt so easy. As they approached Charleston, the waterways grew wider, and the creeks and tributaries so numerous that it looked as if one big rainstorm would submerge the city. A local poet, long deceased, had referred to Charleston as a sea-drinking city. As they descended, Eliza could see all the homes lined up along the marshes, with long, thin docks running to the deep water. She watched her motorboat making a tight circle to pick up a water skier. The afternoon heat had not yet left the day when Eliza's flight arrived in Charleston. She wrestled her bag off the luggage carousel and headed for the taxi rank. She paused for a moment to look at the palmetto trees outlined against the sky. Almost another 3 hours of daylight left, but the descending sun had already begun to pull the color out of the sky. The air was soft and heavy. It was as if someone had put an arm around her. A battered yellow station wagon appeared, and a small black man hopped out. "Where are you going, young lady?" "Downtown, Church Street." Eliza was relieved that Jamie had not come with her. Jamie is her English boyfriend. She was tired, and she wanted to feel what it was like to come back to a place without having to translate or explain. Had Jamie come, he would not have been able to resist telling her that the roadway into Charleston was oversigned, with billboards tempting tourists with promises of perfect beaches, that Charlestonians' references to a colonnaded porch as a piazza was the equivalent of calling it an Italian square, and that Charlestonians' pronunciation of the French street names was not only incorrect but also incomprehensible. Something about a southern accent and not being good at languages. He would, in his mock serious tone, begin discussing, as he did on every trip they had taken, the addition of a new chapter to his imaginary work, A Guide for the Perplexed. On the way into town, Eliza sat back and let herself be soothed by the clunking of the tires of the sections of concrete, past the acres of factories and worn-out land, until the tip of the Cook River Bridge appeared above the railing. They dipped under the overpass and headed up the ramp toward the Cook River Bridge, then down East Bay exit and stopped at the light. Nothing had changed. The massive 3-story Faber Ward house, built in the 1830s and converted to a hotel for freed slaves during the Civil War, still stood haunted and empty, facing land that, for as long as Eliza could remember, was used by the Port Authority for stacking the containers of cargo ships. They continued on down the East Bay, past the slave market, which catered to the tourist trade, and crossed Broad Street. Soon the buildings on the east side gave way to a seawall and promenade, and the name changed from East Bay to Ace Battery. There was something soothing about coming back to a place where there was nothing new to see, where everything was known, where there were only confirmations and never any questions. Eliza knew that once she left the taxi, her journey would no longer feel free and effortless, like the shadow of the plane she had been watching. As they turned onto Church Street and bumped slowly over the uneven brick pavings of the street, Eliza said, "It's a pale, stone-colored house on the left." The past was a kind of weather that pushed in from the harbor and lingered long. Eliza stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the tall 3-story stucco house that had been in her father's family for 6 generations. In Charleston, houses were heritage and were sold only if they had to be. So I'll stop there with Eliza on the sidewalk, and I'm happy to take any questions. But thank you.
I don't have any questions, but I just wanted to let you know that I read your book, and it's beautifully written.
Oh, thank you very much.
I mean, there was never dull moments. I received it at about 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and at 1:30 in the morning I was still reading.
I want to introduce my brother to you. It's not my brother. Thank you so much.
To be perfectly honest with you, I absolutely loved it.
Oh, thank you so
And
much.
not only Eliza, but Henry, beautifully written. I loved it.
I really appreciate it. Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you.
I was very much engaged by the character of Eliza and jolted without revealing it with the ending. So I'm wondering, are you going to write a sequel?
No, I'm not. But I'm going to send you the epilogue that I did write. I'm not. Well, I'm not going to. It's funny because I don't want to give too much away, and I should. But I think I've said what I wanted to say about the South, and I don't think I have anything more to say about right now. So and I'm working on something set in Europe. It's funny because I wrote this book pre-cell phones. I set it in 1990. Because I didn't want cell phones to get in the way of these two characters' relationship, because there was such a romance without cell phones, because you couldn't get in touch with people and you thought about them more, I think. But the book that I'm working on now, the cell phone is super important. So, so we'll see. I don't know. We'll see how it goes, anyway.
I just wondered if, with what you read, whether you struggled with using the word soothe when she's in the car and listening to the tires, and then a few paragraphs later you say that she found it soothing being back in, hearing those words twice so closely together. Obviously it was conscious, and I just wondered what thought went into using those terms.
Oh, well, I don't know if it was conscious, but I think that, and I'll just tell you a little vignette about, and this is about going home. So I gave this talk. I gave a talk at the Harvard Club, and there were a lot of people there, and so it took a long time for people to clear out because it was, everyone was having a lovely time. But after, but, and there were a lot of people who knew each other. But this young man sort of lingered and stayed until the very end, and he came up to me and he said, "I just love it." And I read the same passage. He said, "I really love that passage. It really meant a lot to me." He said, "I grew up right next to JFK Airport, and it's not very nice, and it's sort of a project. And when I bring friends back there, they always say to me, why do you bring friends here? It's just so kind of horrible." And he said, "So I understood your passage." And I'm thinking, well, there's nothing, I thought it's kind of a lovely trip through the acres of worn out land, but what was happening to him happened to me, and my response to him, because it's about going home. And so for me going home, even if you go through some not terribly, not very pretty, not very nice areas, it still has, you see with memory. So it's very pleasant for you. And he said, and that's the same thing for him when he goes back to his home, because he has very pleasant memories about his neighborhood. And so he thinks it's lovely, just as I thought my passage was lovely, but he recognized that. So I did I answer the question about, yeah. And I think there are also certain things that you hear, that if you, on a drive or something, you expect to hear, and that's soothing because it's a return. Any more questions?
Where can we buy it?
Actually, yeah, great. So if there are no more questions, that's brilliant. So thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great.
Folks, we've got a big reception waiting for you on the other side of the store, but you got to buy your books here first. Margaret will sign them either here or on the other side. If you're watching online, give us a call here. We'll get a book autograph for you, and we'll ship it to you. Thank you so much for coming. Thank you.